Wichita for the invitation and for allowing me to speak today as part of the EdTech Talks. I'm also actually very grateful to the EdTech Research Group at the Centre of Excellence in Teacher Education for this opportunity to share one of our recent research projects that I've been fortunate to be a part of. I might just actually start by giving a little bit more, just a little background on the university as well as myself. And thank you so much, Amanda, for that very kind introduction. Look, La Trobe University is a public teaching and research university based in the state of Victoria in Australia. We do have multiple campuses in not only in the city, but also in regional and rural centres throughout Victoria, as well as also a campus in Sydney with just under 40,000 students, which is kind of really wonderful. Yeah, just a little bit of a background, and again, thank you, Amanda, for that, for providing some insight. I was actually arrived into teaching a little bit late in my life, and I always think back about that pivotal moment in deciding to become a teacher. And it was really after the birth of my daughter that really gave me that inspiration to become a teacher. And I do wholeheartedly congratulate all of you that are on that similar pathway on becoming a teacher or educator. So yes, I did actually start off in research as a research assistant working at the Telecom Australia research labs until that organisation decided that research was no longer a core part of its business. And so they started to progressively shut us down, at which point in time, I did move into IT industry. And one thing that really stuck in my mind, and something that I share with my students, is I distinctly remember sitting in an interview for an IT job to work as a software developer for this. It's a government body called the Victorian Railways. And they interviewed me and they asked me, or they gave me an opportunity for me to ask them a question. And I actually did ask them that, that I haven't actually studied computer programming at university. My specialty was in mathematics and physics, to which I'll never forget this, that one of the members of that interviewing panel said, look, we can teach you to program, but we can't teach you to think. And on that basis, that despite I had no computer programming experience, which was quite interesting, because even when I enrolled at a university to do my teacher qualification, they wouldn't allow me to undertake information technology or computing as one of my teaching disciplines because I'd never done it at university. But here was an organisation that was prepared to take me on as a software developer without any prior opportunity, and that was all based on that one statement: we can teach you to program, but we can't teach you to think. And at the end of the day, that's something that really I feel is embodied very much in the heart of teaching technologies that are just wonderful opportunities that we really do immerse students in various forms of thinking, computational thinking, systems thinking, design thinking. So that's something that would always stay in my mind. So yeah, I worked in research. I worked in the IT industry for many years here and overseas. But oddly enough, the university wouldn't allow me to teach that as a subject. Though at the end of the day, I did end up teaching computer science at my school. And that was purely because even though the universities said you don't meet the requirements, at the end of the day, it was really the school principal that determined what I had to teach. And really teaching then became my third career. As I mentioned, after my daughter was born, she gave me that inspiration to become a teacher. And so you might see in that photo down there, that's just an image of one of my year 11 physics classes. We're exploring a topic of motion. And so I'd engage my students in water rocketry. But what you may not notice is that to the right, there is a glass window. And in that window, you can actually see all the other students that were in a history class looking down at what we were doing. So we were very much about hands-on learning. And for me, what I tried to do when I first became a teacher was to bring in those elements of working in research, working in the IT industry, and then try to bring a lot of that hands-on learning into my own classrooms. And that's really important because um, when I think about it, and this is a bit of an old graph. So this is a graph that was produced back in 2008. So it's about almost 17 years old. But this graph stays with me all the time because when I finished my Year 12 studies, which was back in 1981, when you look at the percentage of Year 12 students that were doing physics, which is indicated by that green line, or chemistry, which is indicated by that orange-red line, you'll see that it's up about 30%. So physics and chemistry, 30% of final year students in high school were doing physics, 30%, or a little bit more than 30% were doing chemistry. That was when I finished year 12. But when I decided to become a teacher, back in 2004, I gained my qualification. I first started teaching in 2004. If you look at that graph now, that had actually trended down. So it really shocked me. And I wondered why on earth, have we seen such a drop off in students enrolling in chemistry and enrolling in physics to the point where there was just over 15% were enrolled in physics and a little bit under 20%. And that worried me a lot because I remember physics and chemistry was always really interesting for me. And that gave me, I guess, the motivation to see what can I do as a teacher, educator, to like inspire my students to consider these potentially rewarding career pathways. And even though this data is old, some additional data that I wanted to share with you, just to like give you a bit of an idea for some of the problems that we are struggling with in Australia. And this data is data that I've collected for my home state in Victoria, but the numbers are very, very similar across all Australian states. So this is a good representation of what's happening Australia-wide. And what this graph shows is just really the number of students, the number of Year 12 students in high school that are enrolling in biology, in chemistry, physics, and the other, really important subjects that form the STEM subjects. And what I guess I find really worrying is that when we think about trying to inspire the next generation of creators and innovators. And if you think about those jobs of the future and where technology currently is and where it might be going to, it seems logically that you'd think that surely students would be enrolling in physics and in the computer science subjects of informatics and software development, as well as systems engineering. But when you look at those numbers, you can see how disappointing those numbers really are in those really key subjects of informatics, software development, and systems engineering compared to the other subjects. And so that really gave me inspiration to see, well, what can I do to sort of help to reverse this downward trend of students enrolling in these enabling sciences, as well as in the technology and the engineering subjects. And what's kind of really interesting is when we look at those numbers in those last couple of slides, and we then read what a lot of that rhetoric that's coming, not just simply from the business leaders, but also from governments at various federal and state levels, as well as also from the Office of our Chief Scientist, who clearly said Australians who have studied science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are helping to solve the problems of the future, meeting electricity demand and generation needs, and changing climate, integrating AI into society, and optimizing healthcare for aging. And yet, when we think about that, and this is what our government wants us to do as educators, they want us to sort of like, try to inspire more students to sort of like undertake those subjects such as engineering, such as computer science, and yet unfortunately the numbers at this point in time are quite the opposite. And really, engineering and technology are at the forefront of solving many of these complex and interconnected challenges that really face society today. And for me, being here with you today is also to gain some insight in terms of, you know, are you seeing, is your situation different in terms of student engagement with STEM? Because certainly it's a big issue. It's a big issue for us. And yeah, what I thought I'd also show you here is some of the, I guess, outcomes of the programs and the projects that I had actually got my students involved when I was actually working in secondary school. So on the left-hand side, it may be a little bit unclear, but that's a robot that my students actually built as part of systems engineering that could actually play a game of basketball. And what I did as part of that was to bring in some mentors from engineering firms to work alongside my students. Another program that I did run at my secondary school was something called CANSAT, where students designed, built, and programmed a nanosatellite that could actually fit inside a Coca-Cola can. And what we would then do is that we'd then launch it from a helium blimp from a height of about 250 meters, that you can actually see in that central image there. And what I was actually trying to do was to engage my students in authentic real-world problem solving. The other thing that I've been involved in as a result of these programs is that I then got an invitation of becoming the curriculum writer for our digital technologies curriculum from foundation to year 10, as well as working on the curriculum documents to try to revamp the applied computing curriculum that would make it more relevant and more engaging for students, and in particular, trying to encourage more girls to consider rewarding career pathways in technology. So that was really a bit of an insight in terms of where where I was at in terms of education. And a lot of those programs that I was actually running in schools, whether that was a robotics program or the nanosatellite program, I was able to bring that into the curriculum as well. That would actually then help teachers to try and run similar programs. And that really then opened up the door for myself to undertake my PhD study, and specifically in technology engineering. And as a result of that PhD, short time later, I was working on this project where we were looking at technology, because one of the big issues with technology is that certainly in Australia, the Australian curriculum technologies is only still a relatively recent curriculum. So it was only back in 2017 that technologies was a mandatory subject that teachers from foundation to year 10 actually had to implement. And one of the issues with technology is that because it was actually a new subject area for our teachers, little was known in terms of how well equipped teachers were with implementing digital technologies as well as design technologies into their classroom. And that was really, I think, the catalyst for this research project that looked into technologies education, and also looking at technologies education through the lens of Piaget. And one of the things that's really interesting as educators, when we certainly step into our classroom, we realize that we've got a very large diversity of students. And in fact, one of the documents that I've just shown you there on the right-hand side, it's a document that was produced back in 2018, looking at the state of education and educational excellence in Australian schools. And one of the key aspects that emerged out of this document was that technologies had to become there had to be a greater focus on technologies. But one of the other big issues was that the ability levels of students span up to about 5 or 6 years from the least able student to the most able student. And that presents a bit of a challenge. And I will kind of talk a little bit about that more in a little bit of detail. But the Australian technologies curriculum was seen as being pivotal to achieving the objective of really inspiring the next generation of innovators and creators. But again, little is known of what teachers were actually doing in the technology space. So as part of the research, or as part of our research back at La Trobe University, we looked very closely at Piaget's cognitive development model. And that was purely because it still arguably remains a very critical area of educational research. And there has been considerable effort expended in analysing the work of Piaget and students' cognitive performance across the different subject and learning areas and developmental ages. So the question for us at La Trobe was, how do we know whether a student is developmentally ready to engage in a particular learning activity in the technology's curriculum? And that could involve, say, building an engineering model, such as a model boat from a design brief, or tackling other similar hands-on tasks. And over the years since Piaget first published his work, there has been a lot of research, and what I'm just highlighting here is just a fragment of the different types of research that has actually been implemented. There has been those researchers that have, to some extent, argued against Piaget's cognitive stage model, and because they've actually questioned the whole universality of Piaget's model. They basically argue that Piaget's stage structure did not account for some of that variability that was observed in children. So, for example, a 13-year-old student may struggle to think abstractly during an algebraic problem solving task in mathematics, but yet that same student can actually think abstractly when given a hands-on engineering problem to solve. So those sorts of contrary arguments against Piaget's work that will come into the forefront. And because there was this gap in the research, we saw it as an opportunity to see, well, look, how did Piaget's cognitive stage model hold in the domain of students solving hands-on problem-solving activities? So that was really, the catalyst or the research question that we were kind of like keen on exploring. So we did, extensive literature review in terms of Piaget and in terms of how technologies was taught, in terms of some of the issues in teaching technologies. And there was actually really, I guess, in some respects, two main articles in particular that resonated with us as researchers at La Trobe. And one of those was to do with algebraic reasoning, and a research group led by Cerovac, which used which involved the computerized test to ascertain students' ability to think abstractly in solving mathematics. And it was interesting that the results of this research reinforce the key point. And again, myself being a mathematics teacher as well. So even though I work in academia, I still do consider myself very much a teacher at heart, but also a mathematics teacher, is that topics or abstract topics such as algebra are taught typically around year 8 in secondary school, because that's the stage, or that seems to be the sweet spot at when students generally are able to start thinking a little bit more abstractly. So it seemed to be that certainly in algebraic reasoning, that the work of Susatz and his colleagues um, supported Piaget's cognitive stage model. And similarly with in the literacy space, College Cerovac, they investigated students and their ability to think abstractly using a particular task called a closed task. Now, what a closed task basically is, it's essentially a sentence, but with words or a number of words that have been removed. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that particular research is that when we were developing our research instruments to try to try to ascertain differences in cognitive development between young students versus old students, we were potentially looking at doing something similar to the closed task. So that kind of really gave us the validation for the research instrument that we were going to use. And so basically our research question, or one of the key questions for this particular paper, became, how does student performance vary with task complexity across the concrete and formal operation stages of cognitive development in the capabilities of abstraction and spatial inferential reasoning? Now, we chose those two particular elements of cognitive development, abstraction and spatial inferential reasoning. I should point out that when we talk about abstraction, both abstraction and spatial inferential reasoning are argued to develop with biological age. So really, that's what we were trying to ascertain, was to gain an insight into Piaget's stage structure from the perspective of the Australian technologies curriculum. When we talk about abstraction, abstraction is basically that individual's ability to form a general mental idea for a possible solution to a technology's problem. So, for instance, if I engage my students with the activity of building a boat that floats, the students have got to start to form a mental image of how they're going to make that boat float. So that's an example of abstraction, and it becomes a little bit more. It places a bit more of a cognitive demand of the students once you give them a kit of parts and they're restricted to that kit of parts. So that's what really abstraction is. It's that ability to form a general mental idea for a possible solution to a problem. And it has been traditionally regarded as that ability that emerges relatively late in children's thinking development, and hence why we wanted to undertake this research with two specific groups of students. Students that were in that concrete thinking mode in primary school versus those students that were in secondary schools where they had that formal abstract thinking ability. The other cognitive ability that we looked at was spatial inferential reasoning. And spatial inferential reasoning just refers to that individual's ability to draw upon their prior knowledge and visualize how the different component parts will interact. And so what they're basically doing is transforming that original mental idea that comes from abstraction into a three-dimensional form. And over the next few slides, I'll give you a little bit more insight in terms of what that may look like. But one of the reasons why we were really excited about this particular research project is if you think about that image that's in the middle of the screen there, and you're asked to identify which two of those images are the same. A lot of work has been done in terms of students' ability to mentally rotate images in their mind. So there's been a fair bit of research in that space, but there really hasn't been much in the way of students' ability to mentally visualize solutions in their mind and then turn that mental image into a 3D tactile model. And that was, again, something that really excited us a lot. And so what we actually did was that the research methodology that we chose was one that involved a comparative case study. And we specifically selected two groups of students. And we deliberately selected students that were in what Piaget referred to the concrete operation stage. So they were students that were in primary school. They were typically aged between 8 and 10. And the other group of students that we selected were students from secondary school. So they were students that were in Piaget's so-called formal operation stage. So the senior students that were involved in this project were 15 to 18 years of age. And we basically had 24 junior students and 12 senior students, which gave us about 36 students altogether. And what we did do was that we wanted to see how the students performed on each one of the three tasks that we gave them. We wanted to see how they performed individually, but we're also interested to see how they'd approach each one of those three tasks as a group. Now, one of the big issues that we had was, unfortunately, when the data collection was happening, that's when we got struck by COVID. So that impacted us, to a great deal, to a great extent, which really did restrict the number of students and a number of schools that we could involve. And even today, it still is a bit of a challenge here in Australia to undertake research in schools. There seems to be still a bit of that wash up from the effects of COVID, which certainly impacted us for 2 years. So unfortunately, the number of students that we had for this research was very limited. But we were actually pleasantly surprised that the data that was still managed to collect from this limited number provided an insight into students' cognitive development in relation to Piaget. So what we did was that we developed three tasks. There were three model building tasks, and we borrowed the language from a research group that was involved with a model called the Cynefin framework. And so we designated each task as being either simple, complicated, or complex. With the simple task, students were given a fixed number of parts, and they were given, in fact, a precise number of parts to make a model windmill. The students were also given a complete set of instructions, and those instructions were in pictorial form. So if you think about Lego, and hopefully you've all had an opportunity to sort of build a Lego model. If not, then hopefully you've had an opportunity to put together some IKEA furniture. But it's that sort of pictorial instruction. So that was basically our simple task, because the students had the precise number of parts. They had a full set of pictorial instructions, but they were also shown what their model windmill would look like. So in essence, that placed a very small load on students' cognitive ability to abstract. The second challenge was we designated it as a complicated task. It was complicated because what we actually did was that we removed a couple of the instructions from the full set. So when students were given this kit of parts, and again, it was very much a Lego-like challenge where they had to put together interconnecting plastic bricks and gears and so forth. So they had extra parts given to them, but they also had some instructions that were missing. And what that did was that placed, a moderate load on their ability. So if you think about you're given all these instructions and all of a sudden you're missing a step, you've got to find, what is that bridge between the two steps either side of that missing step. So that's what the students actually had to do. They had to actually try to visualize in their mind which parts had to be put together in a way that would reflect those missing steps. So that was the complicated task. They were still given an image of what the tower crane would actually look like, but there was still that moderate load for them to abstract and then make those important inferences to build a model that worked effectively. And the last challenge that students were given was they weren't given any steps at all. So in fact, the solution wasn't provided to them at all. They had no image of what their steerable boat should look like. All that they were given was simply a design brief. And that design brief really had three key items on it. The boat had to be powered by electricity, the boat had to float, and the boat had to be steerable. And that's all that students were given. And so they're given the full set of parts, but in the steerable boat kit, there was actually one particular element, I should say, that was actually deliberately not put in that kit of parts. It was actually located nearby, but it was not in that kit of parts because what we wanted to do was to sort of really stretch the students. We placed a high cognitive load on the students because we wanted them to see how would they react to this challenge where they had to build a boat that could float, that was steerable, and it could be powered by electricity. To float, they actually had to infer, they had to actually look at that kit of parts and then realize that, okay, we're missing something here, and then look beyond their immediate table. So that particular third task was designated as complex because it placed a high cognitive load on the students. Looking at it a little bit more simply is that for the simple windmill task, this was basically a one-to-one mapping. So the image that's shown there on the right is what the model windmill should look like. It had a handle, so as a research team, we kind of knew when the model was built properly because as we move the handle, the windmill blades will turn around. But there's basically this one-for-one mapping. So for each step, there was actually one set of instructions provided. And so was where we had that one-to-one mapping. For the complicated model where the students had to build a tower crane, they were given all the resources at the start and they were given the end result as well. But you can actually see that there were these steps that were actually missing. So those dashed lines indicate the steps that they were missing that they actually had to visualize and then infer. And lastly, this is the kit of parts that the students were given. So they were given little motors. They were given a piece of cardboard. They were given a piece of paper with a pencil. They were given solar panels. But what they were not given in that kit, but which was placed nearby, was 2 plastic bottles. So they actually had to look immediately below. And the thing in this case here, the reason why this was a complex task is that they had to make a number of design decisions. Do they use a traditional propeller mechanism? Do they use a propeller mechanism that's typical of the airboats that we see on swamps? Do they use a geared motor? Do they use a high-speed motor? Do they use a battery pack to power their motors? Do they use a solar panel? So there are all these different design decisions and inferences in particular that students had to make, which really made it a complex task. So that was basically the research instruments that we used. And we did run a pilot program prior to the 36 students that we had involved with this particular study. And we did that pilot study because we wanted to make sure that these three research instruments worked well. And the way that we assessed the students, and because myself and my colleague, Professor Therese Keane, we both have a teaching background. We developed a rubric as a mechanism of assessing the students, and this is just an example of one of the rubrics that we used for the for students to create the tower crane. But what we did was to measure the students on the quality of their model. And really, it was that rubric that allowed us to ascertain the quality of that model. And this took quite a bit of time, especially because we were involved with a couple of different schools. We're involved with a few different classes, and we wanted to make sure that our marking process was correct. So we had, in some respects, models that were calibrated that we used to assess each of the student models that were built. The other thing I should probably point out is that the complex task itself was a bit unique. So we also did employ an additional measure to assess the quality of the students' performance in building, that difference in ability from the junior students in primary school versus the senior students in high school. And that particular assessment was a measure that we called inference making. And what we did is that this is basically what our findings were. So for that low cognitive demand task, you'll actually notice that these are just six images of the windmill model. So we had 3 examples of windmills built by the junior students. So the junior students are indicated in blue. In green, I should say. My apologies. The junior students' models are indicated in green. The senior students on the right is indicated in blue. So you can actually see, if you do a comparison of those 4 models produced by the junior students, it didn't matter whether they did that task individually or as a group. The senior students performed a little bit better in terms of the quality of their model. The other thing that was interesting is that the senior students were what we consider to be more fluent. Each team made mistakes. So the students working individually or students working in a group, they all made a mistake somewhere along the line. But the senior students were far more quicker in not just simply manipulating the component parts of the model, but they're also quicker to identify where the mistakes were and actually fix them. And the thing that was interesting is that, when we introduced this task to the students, all of the junior students, bar one, had actually had a lot of experience with building Lego. So it was quite interesting that they still struggle a little bit on this simple task. And in fact, the senior students were a little bit concerned after they finished the model that they had not performed as well as the junior students, because many of the senior students hadn't really played with Lego for quite a long period of time. So that was actually quite interesting. In terms of the complicated task, and I'm conscious of time, I'm conscious. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I might just I'm not sure if that's a prompt for me to hurry up. I will move on. I just need about probably 5 or 10 more minutes. So these are just some examples of some of the issues that the students, the junior students had. So they kind of like, rather than relying upon the chain to connect gears to provide the motion, they kind of like intermeshed them. In relation to the tower crane, the observations of the senior students were far more, you can actually see the distinction or the contrast more clearly between the junior students' models versus the senior students. So with this complicated tower crane with instructions that were missing, the students had to visualize the missing steps, and you can clearly see that they really did struggle with the time that they were given to build there. In contrast, the students, the senior students working collaboratively in a group of three, they built a perfectly functioning tower crane model within their 30-minute time frame. The senior student that worked on his own just ran out of time. But you actually see that that model was almost complete. The only thing that was really missing was the cable that ran along that pulley. But you actually see that there is quite a contrast, and yeah, it was kind of interesting that the senior students were far more cohesive and in sharing their problems and in discussing the issues. So, whereas, say, the junior students were a little bit disheartened by the fact that they couldn't build a perfectly functioning model, and they took it a little bit, and they felt a little bit disappointed because they considered themselves to be really good at building Lego, and they built a lot of kits, but they were just so reliant upon being provided with step-by-step instructions. In contrast, the senior students, there was that wonderful discussion going on, sharing their ideas so they could actually form a mental image in their mind, but then articulate that mental image that allowed them to produce a perfectly functioning model. With the complex steerable boat, yeah, again, I won't dwell upon these numbers because I'm a little bit worried about time, but there was significant contrast again between how the students at the senior level approached the problem. Straight away, they were thinking about creating a plan, about drawing a design. And that was one reason why a piece of paper with a pencil was included. But in contrast, the junior students, it was only one particular girl who halfway through the 40 minutes that they were allocated kind of realized we're not going anywhere. Can we make a plan on this paper? But her two team members were just not interested. So whilst the senior students were really started thinking straight away about designing and planning, these junior students, that was either non-existent or came a little bit too late in the process. But even then, the rest of the team was just not really interested. And as a result, you can actually see these are the models that the junior students built. So there were two individuals that built a boat on the left, and there were two junior groups. In contrast, what I'm actually showing you here, one senior student working on their own produced a boat that could actually function, that was steerable, that was powered by electricity, and that could actually float. The senior group on the left there, they came up with this novel way of connecting a propeller mechanism to the motor. So they were able to infer that the elastic tubing that they were provided could be stretched to make a connection between the propeller and the motor, which was one of those main issues that the junior students were coming with. The senior student who built that model in the middle, that's S27, she actually realized that the solar panel could be connected to a makeshift rudder via a motor, and by changing the amount of light that shone on that motor, on that solar panel, that solar panel would then act as an on-off switch to the motor, which then turned the rudder. So she came up with this really fantastic inference that would allow the boat to actually steer. So when we plot the outcome of those three models, you can clearly see from the left to the right, from the simple task to the more complex task, that there was there was a noticeable difference in the ability of junior students and senior students, and really what that highlighted was that when we think about that ability to infer, and we look at those examples of these, the students working either on their own, the senior student working on their own, or the senior students working collaboratively. Each one of those, the individual senior and the group senior, they came up with these novel solutions. They were able to abstract ideas and create some novel kind of like ways of solving the problem. And that wasn't evident in with the junior group. So one of the key conclusions was that that from the perspective of the technology's curriculum, that the junior students, which were in Piaget's cognitive stage of development, were very much were very much struggling with the ability to think abstractly. And the senior students who were in Piaget's formal operation stage, from a technologies curriculum perspective, through solving these hands-on engineering problems, that also supported the fact that that Piaget's stage model is aligns nicely with our observations. The whole notion of planning, designing, which was evident in the senior students, but not so with the junior students, the whole systematic approach to problem solving is very much something that appears when students enter that formal operation stage of development, as opposed to the concrete operation stage of development. So basically, in short, even though we had limited data, what we observed was very much that Piaget's cognitive stage model held up with, when students were given a hands-on engineering problem to solve. And I guess in terms of potential for future research, one thing that we're kind of looking at is repeating these or using the same 3 research instruments, but with more students. We're also looking at what role does language play, because certainly what came out of this research was that the lack of technical vocabulary that students had when they're working collaboratively. So, a second, or I should say, an additional paper that stemmed out of this research that was also recently published was in terms of technical vocabulary, in terms of technological problem solving. So that was something that was an interesting observation. But the other things that we also observe is the potential that gender difference in spatial abilities that we'd like to explore in the future sometime, as well as also the socioeconomic status of students attending a low SES school versus a high SES school. Is everything observable there? Another question that came out of this research was, look, what role does working memory have in solving complicated hands-on engineering tasks? Because that was something that really became evident, even with a simple task, as students were moving back and forth between the 2-dimensional pictorial instructions to the 3-dimensional tactile model that they were trying to put together, that they were struggling, even though they'd worked many times with Lego. The junior students were actually struggling with that. So we seem to think that that working memory plays some sort of a role there. And I guess that kind of really does bring me to the end of this presentation. And I guess the natural thing to think, or the natural probably idea to finish up here is about, so what might be some of the recommendations that come out of this research. And I'm happy to maybe probably share those as part of our discussion. But I've kind of realized that we've been going for about almost 1 hour, so I might actually just stop my presentation there, if that's okay, and just really say thank you and open up to questions, I guess.
Thank you so much. We were actually thinking that since it's a small sized audience, we could probably just have a combined discussion together. So no worries on time. For anyone who has any questions, you can either unmute and just ask, or you can put it on the chat box. Yes, Shubham.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. So from your conclusion, I get to see that this entire research was actually in consonance with what Piaget had to say regarding the
Yes.
cognitive, maturation of children across ages. So I wanted to understand whether there were any outliers in this entire research that you conducted, as in wherein junior students were actually outperforming, and if not outperforming, were performing at par with the senior students. And if yes, then what were the reasons behind them performing in such a manner?
Yeah, look, that's a fantastic question, a really good question, and that's one of the issues that teachers have got to be kind of really mindful, because even when we talk about cognitive development, sometimes it gets mixed up with biological development, and biological development can assist cognitive development, but it can also hinder it as well. So it's natural to have those students that could be potentially outliers. Unfortunately, we didn't really see much in the way of outliers in this research, and which I guess probably is not overly surprising, and that was purely because of a limited number of students. But we'd certainly expect to see some. And in some respects, I was probably a bit disappointed that we didn't, which was unfortunate. But and I think that really goes to the point that we really do need to do more research, with more students. But certainly with the if I, there potentially could have been an outlier, because the one thing that did stand out for me was that there's one particular girl in one of the junior groups who kind of realized halfway through that they were going nowhere, and she thought, look, we need a plan here, and she repeated that 3 times, and it was kind of like interesting, because I guess that what's kind of an interesting, because if you think about neuroscience research, there's evidence that suggests that the cognitive development of girls is a little bit more advanced than that of boys at those year levels. So in some respects, that her taking that lead and her wanting to do a plan was a bit of an outlier itself within that group. And that could potentially be put down to the fact that she might have been a little bit more cognitively advanced than her peers. But that would be probably the only observation. But it's a great question. It really is. I think it highlights more research.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. Um,
Yes, Priya?
Priya?
Yeah. Uh, the paper suggests that in the concrete operational stage, the students that face difficulty in transferring the 2D visual instructions into the 3D model. So I would like to understand your opinion and how the interactive digital tools can help for example, the modeling apps and the touch-based design tools. How can they help in reducing this 2D to 3D transfer deficit problems especially in the concrete operational learners?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure how well I can actually probably answer that one. Yeah, it's certainly the work of Papert would indicate that the stage models could be shifted from concrete to into that formal operations, and it could be a case of exposing the students earlier on to these model building exercises, and then progressively developing those sorts of activities, which I guess which forces them literally to to like to I guess create mental images. But I really don't know, in all honesty, how that may work, because I think one of the issues is that when you think about the neuroscience behind the 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 development of the students, the brains, I guess, the different functional parts there, that's probably going to be a limitation. So I'm not sure how any digital tool could actually probably enhance it in a big way. But I certainly think that there could be like incremental improvements but yeah, I don't know. Unfortunately, again, that could be another opportunity for more research. But great question, Priya. I'm sorry that I can't really answer to that to the fullest.
Thank you.
Good evening,
I
sir.
think so.
Yeah. As a part of my assignment, I had taken Scratch program and I have asked the two stages, that is concrete operational and formal operational stage, to perform an activity. So the Piaget's, the stages were very clear. The concrete operational student were used concrete things, blocks, and then build up, tried a lot, and then did many things. Now, what I faced a problem was like the study which I was conducting, was it justified? Because the student in the formal, in a higher stage, in a formal operational stage, maybe that child may be thinking in such a way because the child is exposed to so many other subjects like physics, the artificial intelligence, and many other subjects the students are learning, and that subjects are giving some kind of thinking process to the students of that age, which a small child may not be exposed to. So how can we study or justify our study in such case?
Okay. Yeah, you got me kind of thinking about yeah. There seems to be. I'm just kind of thinking about that. So it'd be a case of if a child does not have access to tools such as Scratch to develop their. I'm just trying to like wrap my head around the actual question. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm asking that both the students were having exposure to Scratch program.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
They were knowing what the Scratch program is and how to perform the Scratch. But even though, like we say that the student in the formal operational stage has performed much better, but can we say in that way, because already the thinking process of the child has gone to a higher level because of other subjects, the child is exposed to other subjects also.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's actually quite interesting because yeah, that's kind of interesting because yeah, by exposing the students or the children to like a variety of opportunities where they can actually, I guess, think abstractly. It is like you're basically training them, and I think one thing that just comes to mind is that one reason why I'm also interested in gender, because we've got a big issue of not having enough, girls doing computer science or women entering into the IT world, is that when you think about who plays most video games, and it's usually the boys rather than the girls. So, what the boys are doing through playing those video games is that there's an element there that they're actually being trained in their mind to like visualize and develop these mental abstractions. But there is research that suggests that by exposing, and quite often what actually happens when girls go into university to do engineering or computer science, a lot of them tend to drop out because they found that they're just not competent enough. And so there are these intervention programs that are specifically designed to provide training. So training, or in this instance, that what you've just mentioned, by providing opportunities for students to think abstractly in, say, programming in Scratch or doing something else in another subject area, that in itself, I think it's kind of really important to help I think, again, going to Seymour Papert and his notion of constructionism, that can actually help push students from concrete operations into the formal operations to some extent, but it'll still be limited by their brain development, because that's a physical change that needs to happen. But I'm not quite sure how best to answer your question, Razia, so I do apologize. Other than that, look,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think I have a related question. So it's also the cognitive strategies that these students were using. Like you did mention planning
Yeah.
and sequencing. And it's possible that this cognitive strategies also come by training or very deliberately by the curriculum and assessments that train them for using these cognitive strategies, right? And I'm sure, even though this is one of the confounding variables or that influence, but there might be some studies must have looked at, right? I think initially you also spoke about they were using more, the a younger group was using more trial and error, but the senior students were using more planning and sequencing, which could also be trained to some extent. Yeah, just wanted to just compliment. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Amisa, and thank you for that, because we had to be very careful, because we only had a limited number of students, which was just really unfortunate. But when COVID hits, there's not much you can do. But one of the recommendations, if we had to call it that, is that teachers need more guidance in terms of the sort of activities to run. But they've got to be mindful that even if they're teaching, say, primary school and say grade 3 or grade 4, that they're going to have a large variety of students with differences. And those differences in ability to think abstractly may be the result of their environment, where they don't get enough of exposure. So I know when I was younger, I didn't have a video game, so myself and my brother, we'd always be building things. So for me, visualizing things mentally just seemed to be a little bit more natural, because we were like trained that way. But I think it's also important that one of the other recommendations is that the curriculum itself has to provide a clear progression from foundation year, which is in prep or kindergarten, right through to grade 6 in primary, and then from year 7 to year 10 in secondary school. And sometimes that doesn't happen well enough. I know, because I've worked in the redesign of the digital technologies curriculum, that we were very careful to make sure that we had a clear progression path from kindergarten or the foundation year right through to year 10. But even beyond that, in those last 2 years of secondary school, we had a clear progression path. And we provide ideas for teachers, or strategies for teachers, but not all curriculum or subject areas do that well enough. And really, I know when I spoke with the curriculum manager only a few days ago, we still don't know, or that, what a teacher's doing in foundation to year 10. We honestly don't know, because nobody's collecting that data. And sometimes the teachers are a little bit concerned about even sharing what they're doing, because of that fear that they might be doing the wrong thing and they might get into trouble. At the end of the day, we are just here to help them. So there is that issue as well. And sometimes teachers do miss or misunderstand the intent of what the curriculum's telling them as well. But you raise a really good point there, Amina.
Thanks. Yeah, sounds very familiar with our context as well. Thanks. Yeah.
But the other thing just on that is that we recently had this article published on technical vocabulary, and one thing that became obvious is that we don't have any clear expectation of what teachers should be teaching technical vocabulary. So when the students are picking up bits and pieces, it'll be reference to that grey thing or that round thing or that black thing or that green. There was what's this thing mean? It's all these vague pronouns when, that's a gear or that's kind of like, a link or something. Yeah. So that was actually quite, but the curriculum itself doesn't tell teachers. It says use appropriate terms, but what's appropriate? So yeah. So the curriculum needs a lot of work, certainly here in Australia. Sorry, thank you.
So we have two questions on the chat box as well.
Okay.
And we have two more waiting in line.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
great.
we can take these two, and then I think those would be the last questions.
Yeah, that's
Because
fine.
yeah, okay.
I should have actually pointed out that I'm not an expert on Piaget. It just happened to be that it aligned really well, with the research as well. So just actually, in your research methodology, were the gender and socioeconomic backgrounds considered before selecting for the research, and does these factors have any effect on the stages of cognitive development? Oh, look, that's a fantastic question. In relation to gender, we didn't really have much choice because the students were randomly allocated to groups. So we had some groups where it was all girls or all boys or a mix of girls and boys. But certainly for the socioeconomic background, we wanted to minimize the number of confounding variables. So the schools that were selected, and there were three key schools that were involved ultimately, and they were all from the same socioeconomic status. And the way that we determine that is that I think it's every 10 years, there's a census that takes place in Australia. And what happens is that each suburb is put into a socioeconomic zone, anything from number 1 to number 10. So that's how we kind of manage that. But in relation to gender, we didn't have as much control. But what was interesting was that the girls tended to be more assertive in the junior groups. When we ran the pilot, as well as the main study, the girls tended to take more of a backseat role. And that was kind of like an interesting observation. That's why, moving into the future, what we'd like to at some stage is to collect more data and just look at the gender. But that's a great question. And yeah, and I think that there could be a link to cognitive development. Certainly, I think in the junior years, because I do remember looking at some of the research in neuroscience that does look at the different parts of the cognitive function of the brain, and it does develop differently with girls being at a higher maturity than boys in those younger years. So the answer would be yes. I'll just quickly move on to the next one because I'm worried about the time as well. One of the references mentions embodied cognition. Could you please speak about embodied cognition? Look, to be honest, I'd have to actually probably look at that because I don't know if I could actually, I don't know if I can actually be fair and true to the actual real intent. So, Arun, I think that's a good question, but I might have to actually pass on that one. I'm so sorry about that.
I think Lokesh can ask the last question for tonight.
Yeah, and if there's time, Sakshi, because she had raised her hand, we'll see. Yeah, go ahead, Lokesh.
Sorry, Lokesh, and thank you for your patience.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for this wonderful presentation, Professor. And my question is around, I also had similar observation while I was engaging students in two different mediums, one in local dialect, local language, and the other one is English. So was there any influence on the linguistic part of it, like how students were, like, were there any different language or as a medium of instruction, or that is one of the questions I wanted to ask. And also, was there an influence of parental background on these student cognitive ability? If children coming from engineering father or mother who is working in the technical area, was it like, have you done any observation around that? That is one. And yeah, that's all I wanted to ask.
Yeah, they're great questions. Thank you, Lakesh. Yeah, look, linguistically, there was, I think, yeah, the language, because with there were, how can I actually frame this? There, in one of the schools, in the junior schools, there was a high proportion of students where English is an additional language. So the answer to your question there is actually it's something that's really good, and something that would, I guess, probably worth following up on with further research. That probably it may have impacted on the ability of the students, but certainly, but I think the impact probably may have taken the form of that lack of technical terminology and that constant reference to these vague pronouns of this thing, that thing, or the other thing, or the round grey thing. So that may have influenced some of the exchange of the ideas, but it's not something that from examining the audio recordings and the video recordings, it's not something that seemed to be a major factor that was contributing to the quality of the model construction. So that would be an interesting angle to take for further research. So thank you for sharing that question, Lakesh. The other thing about engineering background, what was interesting is that with the junior students, there was quite a there were a few students whose parents had either an IT background or worked as engineers. But for the senior students, the background was predominantly parents who were working in finance or working in businesses or working in legal. And so what was interesting is that the junior students who did have like parents with engineering backgrounds, their models were still quite, were lacking in terms of their quality compared to the older students whose parents were predominantly working in the working professionals. So in both junior and senior students, all of the parents were professionals, but there seemed to be more parents that were engineers or IT for the junior group of students as opposed to the senior. I'm not sure why that was actually the case, but it didn't really benefit the students in terms of their quality. And in fact, I had one student who took a lead role in the junior group, who was a little bit disappointed that they didn't quite get their windmill working. That the very next week, when I was back there to collect more data, he brought in a Lego model of what he had built, just to like show that I can build Lego. This is my wonderful model, and it was really great to see. So it was interesting that the junior students, all but one, identified as being experienced Lego builders. So in theory, they shouldn't have had as much trouble building both the simple windmill or the complicated tower crane. They shouldn't have had as much trouble as what they did compared to the senior students. So yeah, so to answer both questions, it really didn't appear to have an impact. But it's certainly something I'd like to take away with me, and hopefully we'll get around and collect more data with the larger cohort group. Thanks, Lakesh. Thank you. These have just been really fantastic questions, can I say? So it's really got me thinking a lot. And I do apologise for those that I wasn't able to answer. And it's just purely because it's kind of starting to stray a little bit outside my domain of expertise.
I think I can speak for all when I say it's been quite an enlightening talk, and we've all got our thinking hats on now. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to call an end to this session. So thank you so much once again for coming this late at night and delivering this talk. And we will see, and thank you to the audience as well. And we will see all of you very soon for our next EdTech Talk.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. As well, Uchita and Mina, and thank you again for the invitation. It's been yeah, it's been kind of really yeah, fantastic, and thank you for all the wonderful questions. They were kind of really brilliant. So thank you.
Sure. I think we'll come back to you because this is a topic that we keep discussing. But it was so nice to have you and hear from you and from the prime. In fact, I didn't tell you, but this reading that you and Therese have published was part of one of the readings in Learners and Learning Classroom. So some students have read it, and one student also presented, and I think they are very excited to hear from the primary author. So that was great. Thank you so much.
Well, pleasure. Look, I'm truly honoured. So I'm really truly honoured. So thank you for using our particle. So our article. So thank you.
Thanks and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.